Stepping down and handing power to his son, Qatar's ruler puts a new generation in charge of the country's vast energy wealth and rising political influence. But what message is the Emirate sending to the region and the wider world? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rida Fakhri. It is a rare transition of power, a reigning Emir voluntarily giving way to a new generation. Qatar's Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa al-Thani is stepping aside after 18 years in charge to be replaced by his son Sheikh Tamim. The 33-year-old will now take the helm of the tiny nation whose oil and gas wealth has altered the course of events across the Middle East and projected Qatar onto the international stage. James Bays reports on a historic day.
It's a transition almost unheard of in the modern Arab world, a ruler announcing he's giving up power voluntarily.
As I address you today, I declare that I will hand over the reins of power to Sheikh Tamim, and I'm fully certain that he is up to the responsibility, deserving your confidence, capable of shouldering the responsibility, and fulfilling the mission.
It was an end to 18 years at the helm, a reign that started at a time of his own choosing. Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa al-Thani was the Crown Prince and Minister of Defence in 1995 when he took over in a bloodless coup while his father was on an overseas trip. He said he needed to take hold of the reins in order to use Qatar's great wealth to modernise the small country, then a barren peninsula considered a backwater. In his first few years as Emir, Sheikh Hamad expanded the energy infrastructure, the source of the country's wealth. He also set about putting Qatar on the map. He abolished the country's Ministry of Information, helping to establish the Arab world's first satellite news channel, Al Jazeera. Next, a brand new global airline started from scratch. These were projects that brought prestige and influence. Slowly at first, Qatar and its Emir became important players on the diplomatic stage. In the Middle East, a region where divisions are rife, the door was left open to all sides. Take the example of Sudan. Qatar maintained relations with President Omar al-Bashir's government, yet invited his rivals to Doha and staged peace talks. Instead of long drawn-out process, Qatari diplomacy was marked by quick action. When briefly gun battles started raging in Beirut in 2008, the Emir sent his long-serving Prime Minister to the city and brought leaders from all parts of the political spectrum to Doha to draw up a new peace deal. When villages in southern Lebanon were destroyed by Israeli bombardment, Qatar stepped in to rebuild them. In the last year, a visit to Gaza and another pledge of investment and reconstruction. Following the start of the Arab Spring, Qatar has played a pivotal role around the table of the Arab League. Increasingly involved in the complex decision-making which led to Qatari support for the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and now backing for the opposition in Syria, has been Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad al-Thani. Now the new Emir, Sheikh Tamim, has been greeting prominent members of Qatari society. Beside him, his father, who at this time of tension and change in the Arab world made a plea for unity.
As I am confident that you are fully aware of your loyalty and your Arab and Muslim identity, I urge you to preserve our civilized traditional and cultural values originating from our religion, Arab identity, and above all, our humanity, as we believe that the Arab world is one human body, its strength in that combination of all its individual parts.
Sheikh Hamad's announcement that he was going to break with tradition and stand down was made here at his palace in Doha. During his reign, Qatar has pursued an ambitious, some would say controversial agenda. One thing, though, is beyond doubt. He's transformed this country. None of the buildings behind me even existed when he first assumed power. There are many challenges ahead, but this handover is almost unprecedented. The Emir, who said in 1995 that for the sake of his country he was taking control early, has now, 18 years later, given it up early too. James Bays, Al Jazeera.
plenty to discuss with our guests. Here in Doha, Hassan al-Ansari, editor-in-chief of the Qatar Tribune newspaper and former director of the Gulf Studies Centre. In our London news centre, Ian Black, Middle East editor of the Guardian newspaper. And in our Washington studios, Blake Hounshell, deputy editor of Politico magazine. Hassan al-Ansari in Doha, needless to say, this is a region that isn't used to rulers stepping down voluntarily. What was the main factor that played into Sheikh Hamad's decision to hand over power to his son?
It is, I think, his character. Sheikh Hamad has this character, and as the piece showed, he stated, when he took over in 1995, that he didn't do that for the sake of power, and he was just grabbing power, but he felt the responsibility, toward the country and the people. Therefore, he took over the country, and he promised that he will modernize the country. He will do whatever, to make the people prosperous in this part of the world, and to be engaged and help, which he did. And today,
but why now, though? Why now specifically? It's such a crucial time in the region, and with Qatar playing such an increasingly influential role.
I think because he always believed that it is also a message to the outside world, that look, he the Emir is so popular in the country, he is loved and he is admired for all of his work, and he decided that to send a message also to the outside world. Look, you don't have to grab power forever. You don't have to kill your people, to do that. You don't have to destroy your country, There is always a way, to go to the second generation, as second leader to take over. Therefore, we see him that, he's telling everybody, look, I'm popular, I'm everything, but, willingly, I'm willing to give up power. And I'm so confident on Sheikh Tamim, to take over. And the people of Qatar, always admire him, for his courage, and he showed it this morning.
Blake Hounshell, is this all about internal rather than external changes? Because some people have argued that this transition may have been the result of some international, particularly US pressures to see change in leadership that includes the Emir handing over power to his son, but also the departure of his powerful and influential Prime Minister, Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim, change that aims to curb essentially Qatar's support for some jihadist groups in Syria and some parties connected with the Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere. Could there have been serious American pressure that led to this?
Well, I strongly doubt that there was any American pressure about internal Qatari politics. I do know that there was some unhappiness in the White House about Qatar's role in Syria and allegations that Qatar has been dealing with jihadi groups, sending weapons to Jabhat al-Nusra, specifically in Syria. I don't know the truth of those allegations, but my understanding is that when the Emir came to Washington recently, that was very much a subject of discussion. Now that said, I think Washington and Doha have excellent relations. They're very close. They certainly have their differences, like any couple, I would say. Washington isn't very happy with Qatar's relationship with Iran, but in some cases, Qatar's friendships with rogue states, if you want to call them that, have been very useful. Like the Taliban opening this office in Doha could be a prelude to a solution to the end of the Afghan war. So I think the relations are good. There's certainly issues where they disagree, but the friendship is strong.
Ian Black, beyond the diplomatic statements from Western capitals congratulating the new Emir, how will London and other capitals look at this transition of power? Will they see it as perhaps the beginning of a democratic process, or nothing more than a simple transition of power from father to son, however unusual it is in the region?
I think there are two things here. The decision of the Emir to hand over power to Sheikh Tamim, the new Emir, has been a long time in the making. It's been signalled. The Emir has been talking about it in Washington, certainly when he was last there, but even earlier than that, over the last couple of years, certainly to friends who know him well, they've been talking about that. The precise timing wasn't clear until Al Jazeera yesterday reported that the Emir had brought together the family and the key decision makers in Qatar to make this announcement. But I don't think any government, not in London and elsewhere in Europe, Washington, will have been surprised by the decision. I found actually just yesterday, looking back over the leaks of US diplomatic cables from WikiLeaks a couple of years back, a report from the US Embassy in Doha in 2009 talking about how Sheikh Tamim, the Crown Prince, was being groomed to take over and was being given more and more responsible decisions to make. So I don't think any surprise. I think that a government which saw this as the beginning of a democratic transition would be misreading the signals. This is a transition within the family, if you like. There's no sense of pressure from below in Qatar. It's a very, very small country, as we know, a very, very wealthy one that's been active, very active indeed, in promoting the changes and the uprisings elsewhere in the Arab world, in Libya, of course, in Egypt, and of course, most strikingly and currently in Syria. Internally, Qatar is clearly not a democracy. I observed that one of Sheikh Hamad's last moves was to prolong the life of the current advisory council, thus putting off, in effect, parliamentary elections that had been talked about for next year. So I don't think it's a correct reading of this to see it as a democratic change, but it is, importantly, a handing over of power from one generation to another, which is extremely rare in the Arab world and, of course, in the Gulf.
Hassan al-Ansari, do you see any contradiction between these two moves by the former Emir, Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa al-Thani, the fact that he stepped down now in favor of his son, the new generation, but at the same time, one of his last moves was, in essence, to delay and postpone indefinitely any elections?
I don't think that's the case. I think because of the transition and his decision to do that, I think he stated before he stepped down that election will happen, and I believe that it will happen. It will happen in Qatar. It will take time, but it will happen definitely. I don't think the situation in the Arab world is moving and helping to that direction, but I think that will happen, and this is nothing to do with his decision to step down and therefore to prolong not having election in the country.
How much then does this decision have to do with balancing the competing internal domestic dynamics, certainly within the al-Thani family as well, dynamics that may be pulling in a more conservative direction?
No, I don't think so. That's the case. A lot of people, they ask, whether there will be a change in the policy and everything. And as your guest, stated that, Sheikh Tamim is not somebody who is not involved and not part of the key decision makers in Qatar for the last 10 years. He's been giving very big files, to handle domestically and internationally. He's in charge of education and health and environment and sports. So he's been, involved there, from the beginning. And I think, the Emir, decided that it's time, for him, to take full responsibility and full control of the country, and he trusts him. Look, this is normal relationship between Qatar and the United States and its allies. And, as you say, that within the family itself, within your household, you don't see eye to eye, with your partners. Or therefore, it's the normal things. We agree on the United States in many issues, in a wider issue, and we have our disagreements. And you remember that, during the Bush administration, the disagreement was there.
And there were disagreements and there were ups and downs in this US-Qatar relationship, yes, no doubt. Yeah. Blake Hounshell, the Emir of Qatar, notably the former Emir now, never really gave into a lot of the pressures that were put on him during the administration of President Bush, the kinds of pressure that were applied on him to close down Al Jazeera because of some of the coverage that the Americans were not happy with. John Kerry, a couple of years ago, said this, I quote him, "Qatar can't continue to be an American ally on Monday that sends money to Hamas on Tuesday." Well, despite that, the Emir had very good relationships with the leaders of Hamas. So do you expect this kind of independent streak in the Qatari leadership to continue?
Absolutely. I think Qatar's independence streak is the product of geography. It sits between these two giants in the Gulf, Iran and Saudi Arabia. And it's on the fault lines of a lot of different conflicts in the region and the wider world. And Qatar's position triangulating between the West and the East is a product of that. And I don't think it's going to change whether it's Sheikh Tamim in power or Sheikh Hamad or whomever.
Ian Black, how do you expect to see Sheikh Tamim continue to manage these seemingly conflicting interests? We mentioned earlier that Qatar hosts a US military base. It just opened a Taliban office. It supports religiously conservative groups in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. How easily will it be for him to continue this type of seemingly contradictory policy in some ways?
I think that what's likely to happen over the coming period, not too quickly, nothing sudden, I think that we will see perhaps something of a reining in, a curtailing perhaps of Qatar's wider ambitions. I was interested to hear what Blake Hounshell had to say from Washington about the effect of the Syria crisis. I think that if you follow these things, it is sort of common knowledge that Qatar over Syria has kind of got ahead of itself, got a bit carried away. I think there is a real sense of the support coming from Qatar, whether from the government or individuals licensed by the government, to some of the more radical groups fighting the Assad regime. I think that's caused real problems. And I think we've seen in recent weeks, quite clearly reading the diplomatic tea leaves, as it were, we've seen Saudi Arabia, obviously the regional power, Qatar's big neighbor, taking over with the encouragement, I think, of the Americans and the British and others, taking over the support of the Syrian rebels in a way that is easier to control. And I think that we will look back and see Qatar involvement in these big events of the Arab Spring, particularly Libya and Syria, as something which perhaps won't be repeated. I think there's already a sense of a decline of Qatar's role in Syria in particular. And I expect that given the disappearance of these very big figures, the Sheikh Hamad and apparently also Hamad bin Jassim in the coming days, I think that Qatari policy will be less high profile, less ambitious, will act in ways to give less people cause to resent it, or even worse. It's a very small country with tremendous reach and of course wealth. And I think looking ahead to the developmental and social challenges that Qatar faces within its own small borders, there's likely to be more focus on these than on these regional ambitions. Having said that, of course, it's going to be running the Arab League for another few months, and it's not going to give up that position. But I think that its political profile on Syria, perhaps in particular, may become a little lower.
Will we see, Hassan al-Ansari, a very different public image for Qatar under the leadership of Sheikh Tamim, a less aggressive, less assertive, perhaps more inward-looking way of doing things? There has been, as Ian Black has suggested, some resentment in some countries to do with the kind of influence that Qatar has exerted, whether political, economic, or military. And I'm thinking about the influence of Qatar in Libya, in Egypt, in Syria, and other countries in recent times.
I don't think, I would look at it differently, in this regard. I don't think, there is a diminish of Qatar roles. Qatar from the beginning, when it started, trying, to influence, the Arab Spring, trying to help all of this stuff, it was basically alone in the region, to do that. Now, I think, what's happened right now, we see that more countries and more power within the Middle East started to engage themselves with that. And with that, I think, Qatar is welcoming that. So, Qatar never, thought of this, as competing or trying to do things. Qatar at the end, that's a small country, with a small population. And, we are not in a business, to create something to dominate the Middle East, We would like our neighbors to be peaceful, prosperous, democratic. That's what we are, because it is in our interest. Now, I think, in Qatar, we are happy to see, other parties in the Middle East playing a role in the Arab Spring. And that's, nothing to do with competing or trying, to have such a thing like that. So therefore, I see that's, our roles, in supporting and helping. And if you heard Sheikh Hamid's speech this morning, he told the people of Qatar, stay the course. Do not, just yield, and do not step over your principle, If people, need your help, extend your hands and help them. And that's what Qatar doing from the beginning.
Blake Hounshell, do you expect to see much effect from this this development here in Qatar on other rulers, other models of leadership in the Arab world, in the Gulf countries? Will it put more pressure on some of the older generation of rulers, for example, to follow suit, to talk about the issue of abdication and to perhaps even act on it?
I think Qatar has been very careful to reassure its friends in the Gulf that the intention here is not to embarrass them or try to promote change elsewhere in the region. But surely, activists in the Gulf, particularly in places like Kuwait, are going to look at this and think, if the Emir of Qatar can abdicate, why can't Sheikh Sabah or someone else in the region? So, there might be pressure coming from below, and activists seize upon this. But the message coming from the Qatari leadership is, this is about Qatar. This is not about anywhere else in the region, and we're doing it for our own good and for our own reasons.
Ian Black, no doubt Qatar has played a prominent role in recent years also in trying to host many high-profile events, sporting events. We know it's going to host the 2022 World Cup. It also has its eyes set on other big, ambitious sporting events as well. Does it suggest then that Qatar will have to continue with this modernizing trend that the Emir Sheikh Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani has begun? And what do you expect to see in terms of changes in the image of Qatar when it comes to women's rights? Sheikh Moza having really asserted herself on the international scene and allowed other Qatari women to play a very active role.
Well, I think it's good that you mentioned Sheikh Moza, who I think has played a very, very positive and very, very high-profile role as well. Of course, Qatar has been a tremendous success in establishing itself over Sheikh Hamad's rule as a brand name. It was a place that was a sleepy backwater. I remember visiting myself in the mid-1990s, just before the coup in which Sheikh Hamad took over, and the transformation, as anybody who knows, who's been to the place over that period, has been extraordinary. The use of its wealth, its acquisition of sporting events and cultural events, not only, of course, the World Cup of 2022, but there's talk, I think, fairly serious talk of Qatar competing for the Olympics 2 years after that in 2024. It's spent its money wisely, it's made amazing investments, it's become a big player. And I think that all those things will be very much the focus of this new period under Sheikh Tamim in the coming years. See it perhaps as a period of consolidation with that very young population. And as to what happens elsewhere in the region, I think people will watch Qatar with a mixture of fascination and irritation because it is somehow licensed to be maverick. But my sense is that it will concentrate on its own affairs, on its version, if you like, of responding to the events of the Arab Spring, not by bringing in a democracy as people have tried to do and are trying to do elsewhere, but by its own version of change. And first and foremost, I think the message is clear that that's one of handing over to that younger generation. To have a ruler who is 33 when so many other rulers in the region are twice or even 3 times his age, I think is a very important signal about the way it sees itself heading.
Certainly a very interesting and important day here in Doha. Thanks to all our guests for sharing their thoughts with us. Hassan, al-Ansari, Ian Black and Blake Hounshell. And thank you, of course, for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. There's much more at aljazeera.com. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team, thanks for watching.